They uploaded the clip at 2:14 a.m. Shaky phone light, a narrow alley, a short, brutal burst of noise, then Michael Ward stepping into that strip of night like a man who belonged there. He did not shout or pose. He moved with the economy of someone who knew what to do and wanted only to end it. A shove, a pull, a grounded weight, the attackers scattered. Someone laughed on camera as if this were entertainment. The caption read something like, "Construction guy tries to be a hero, wants clout?" The first wave hit like cold water. 10,000 views, a dozen cruel comments. The clip, meant to shame, became an argument. Half the internet mocking, half debating whether the man in the clip was brave or showy. Somewhere between the retweets and the memes, his name slid into 1,000 feeds. Michael Ward, single father. The caption didn't know the rest. At 6 the next morning, Michael was in the kitchen humming a tune he'd made up for his son. The apartment smelled of coffee and toast and something smaller, baby lotion, and the faint, unmistakable scent of a boy who liked to find crumbs in the couch cushions. Ethan sat in a high chair, fingers curled like little anchors, watching his father with patient, solemn eyes. He didn't make the sounds other children his age did. He never had. Doctors said words like indefinido when he asked them for a cause, and Michael learned to let that word rest there, a neat, empty place so doctors could not hand him false certainty. Ethan's world was mostly small things. Tiny cars lined up on the windowsill, a dog plush with one button eye, the toothbrush Michael bought after realizing the one that sung to the tune of pop songs did nothing for this child's understanding of rhythm. But he'd figured out the brush had a calming weight for bedtime. Michael fed him, wiped his mouth, kissed the crown of his head with the care somebody gives a fragile, treasured thing. He had left the world that trained men to move like machines because the other life, the one with clean-cut uniforms and the promise of travel, had asked for more than a man could give a child. He had chosen a job that had calluses and honest hours and a paycheck that arrived without speeches. He had chosen to be there for Ethan's first bath, first scraped knee, first small triumphs. He kept a pen in his pocket. It was a broken, heavy thing, not because it still wrote, but because it had held messages for years. The clip had shown him pulling someone back from a fall. It had not shown his hands going into his pocket afterward, fingers brushing cold metal. He had kept it there since the day the world he'd been trained to protect stopped being his first allegiance. The pen's barrel was engraved with something worn to a faint shine, a ribbon of letters that meant more to a few people than to the rest of the city. A video like that does two things in the modern age. It tells a tale on a loop, it fractures a life in headlines. And it brings strangers to your doorstep. By mid-morning, someone from a local news station showed up at the apartment building. Michael left the cameras to the super and told them no, he didn't want to do an interview. He worked with his hands and had no taste for being a spectacle. The men in his crew at the construction site called him both hometown hero, the tone of their voices laced with something practical and embarrassed, and showboat in the same breath. His supervisor, a man with a laugh that still sounded like machinery oil, slid a paper cup of faded coffee across the trailer and raised an eyebrow like a question whose answer mattered. "Are you going back?" Michael's answer was the quiet truth. "No," he said, "I'm not going back to that life." He said it with the same certainty he used to pack Ethan's lunch the night before. There were other costs. A few coworkers nudged aside when a streamer in the comments dug into his past, finding old photos of Michael in uniform, with a different haircut and a different gait. A hashtag he never wanted trended for 2 days. Who is Michael Ward? And the tone of the internet alternated between thin admiration and stomach-deep cruelty. People in line at the bodega recognized him and asked for a selfie. Michael obliged once, hand steady but unshowy, the way you hand a coin to a child so they won't be startled. He kept thinking of Sarah. She had been everything that made him stay. She taught him how to braid a tiny bit of hair off Ethan's forehead, even though it was mostly flat. She had been the first to call him brave, and the first to argue that bravery and attention were not the same thing. After she died, he had learned the difference between being noticed and being needed. The threat that mattered most wasn't the internet. It was the shadow of those two men who had been in the alley. They were younger, their edges frayed with the kind of menace that thinks it owes nothing. They had no idea who Michael had been or what he'd once done. They only knew they'd been made to look foolish in a clip that would be replayed while people ate dinner. Anger, for them, was a thing you fixed with another act. Rumors started to ricochet through the neighborhood. They knew where he worked, someone whispered. They'd been seen at the end of the block. Michael came home from his shift carrying a duffel bag with his lunch and a quiet kind of dread he had not admitted to. He hired a babysitter because his shift started earlier and Ethan's routines could not be broken. You don't put a child like Ethan into a daycare where strangers turn over like pages of a used book. You find someone who stays. Mia came recommended by a mother from the church whose face Michael could not remember one Sunday to the next. Mia was 25, steady-handed, with a laugh that felt like a pause in a noisy room. She arrived at 3 p.m. with her hair in a messy bun and a canvas tote with sunflowers on the side. She knocked, came in, smiled at Ethan like she'd always known him, and immediately asked about the toothbrush. "You let him chew it?" she asked, genuinely curious. "He likes the weight." Michael watched from the doorway as she crouched to Ethan's level, offering the tiny bristles like an offering. She had a way with the small things, the lighting of bedtime lamps that weren't too bright, the arranging of stuffed animals just so. She did not ask many questions about Michael's past. When people have weight in a life, they do not always demand an inventory of the heart. She proved trustworthy by doing ordinary things well. 2 nights after the clip, when the dusk had the kind of blue that makes the city lights look like a slower heartbeat, Michael heard a tapping from the living room. He came out sweaty from work, the smell of concrete and dust on his jacket. Mia sat on the couch with Ethan in her lap. She was holding a small object between thumb and forefinger and looking at it like it was a secret she had been carrying for a long walk. "What's that?" Michael asked. His voice carried the tiredness of a man who had been on his feet for 12 hours and the acute attention of someone whose life pivoted on the small details. Mia turned the object. It was the pen. Not whole, the clip broken off, the engraved letters dulled by years of sweat and pocket gray. He'd left it tucked in Ethan's backpack ages ago out of habit. Sometimes he took it out to fidget, or to write a note, or to trace the engraving when he needed a certainty the world could not take away. He did not know when it had fallen into the lining of Ethan's pack. He reached for it and froze. Mia's thumb brushed the engraving with a gentleness that did not belong to someone who was simply curious. "Do you mind if I?" she said. "I found this in the backpack and I wanted to make sure you knew I saw it." Something in her manner made him think of Sarah at the bedside lighting a lamp for a storm. Mia did not wave it away or laugh. She did not fumble an explanation. She held it up, and in the low living room light, the letters caught like a tiny sun. Michael's chest tightened. He had not told Mia anything beyond Ethan's bedtime rituals and the list of foods to avoid. He had not intended for his life to be an open ledger on a stranger's kitchen table. He had expected maybe a lost toy, a crayon, the usual detritus of boyhood. He had not expected this, return of his past, not when he had chosen to consign it to pockets and old photos. "I thought it was a pen," Mia said, "but someone I used to know, my uncle, he recognized the pattern on the engraving. He said it's something like a token people carry when they've been with a particular unit. People who gave a lot away. He said it means people owe you favors in a way. She turned the pen so the light hit the dent on the side, and her voice dropped a notch, careful as if she held a newborn. Michael's hands went cold. The world contracted into the strip of couch between them, into the soft breathing of Ethan, into the metallic presence in his palm. He had kept the pen because it was Sarah's way of not letting him leave completely. He had kept it because it fit the curve of his fingers and because the engraving was a promise he had not meant to break. Mia's words hit like a rock thrown at glass. "You mean like connections?" he asked. "Like people who'd know me?" Mia nodded. He said people who have names like that, they remember. He said sometimes they can help fix things adults can't. He said it would be rude to assume. He thought of offers he had refused, of a life inside apartments that smelled of better coffee and quiet suits. He thought of invitations to travel for work he had turned down so he could be home for the first time Ethan blinked at sunlight. He had not wanted a network to intrude on what he and his son had. He did not want favors. He wanted predictability. He wanted to patch the holes. Later that night, alone with his cup of coffee gone tepid, Michael took the pen into his hands and read the engraving as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something else. They said the same thing they had always said, something small, almost indecipherable. He had never wanted that part of his life to be a weapon or a ticket. It had been there like a relic in an old pocket, the sort of thing you keep because it's all that's left of a time you respected. Mia's discovery did what a small, honest thing often does. It opened a door he'd been keeping shut. He told her what he could, not everything. Some histories have rigid borders. He told her Sarah's name, the day they had both decided to stop moving, the feeling of turning his back on a different kind of prestige to be a man with honest hours. Mia listened without astonishment. She nodded as if the choices made sense. She did not turn the story into a spectacle. "You did the right thing," she said when he finished. "Ethan is lucky." He wanted to believe her, and yet he carried the residue of the video like grit beneath his skin. That night he did not sleep. He lay in the dark and made the pen a tiny talisman between his fingers. He had told himself for years that he did not crave the past. The truth was messier. He did not want to step back into the world of careful movements and protected families for applause. He wanted leverage he could use for Ethan if something worse ever rose up. A pen could be a ticket if it meant a voice on his side. The next morning, Mia did something Michael hadn't expected. She took a picture of the pen and texted it to the number she had been given, her uncle's contact. She wrote a short note. "Found this. It belongs to Michael Ward. He's a good father." The tone was simple and small. She sent it because sometimes small things need witnesses. Within 24 hours, the ripples turned to a current. A woman named Isabella Lane replied. Her message was short at first, something like recognition masking surprise. She had seen the pattern on the pen years ago in a different city, among people she did not name. She said she had some familiarity with the circle the pen suggested, people who protected without question for a living. She asked to meet. She asked to learn. There was, in her words, a tenderness that could be mistaken for curiosity, and a promise that felt like a possibility. Isabella Lane was, in the city's small and murmuring ecology of influence, a particular kind of presence. A CEO with a voice on the radio and a face on philanthropic banners. She had been connected once, long ago, to those who stepped into dark alleys so others could sleep. She also knew, the messages implied without boasting, how to make that knowledge matter. She visited the apartment not with cameras, but with the quiet of someone who did not want spectacle. She brought flowers for Ethan that were shockingly simple, a potted succulent and a book on things to look at in the sky. She sat on Michael's couch and looked at the broken pen with a respect Michael found unfamiliar in a public person. "You saved someone important to me a long time ago," she said. Her voice carried the kind of memory that does not require details. "You once protected a family I love. I owe that our lives were different because of you." There are moments when public acclaim arrives like a rush of heat leaving after a thunderstorm. His name, which had been shadowed by mockery, now traveled in a different direction. Editorials appeared that painted him not as a pseudo-celebrity-seeking man, but as a man who had traded a career for a son. A long-form piece ran with a photograph Isabella provided, a photo of a night years ago, a grainy image of a young man in uniform. The narrative shifted. People debated again, but a new force moved the conversation, explanation instead of assumption. The comments that had been sharp softened. The clip still circulated, but now there were threads in the replies talking about what it meant to make hard choices for children. People began to call him a hero, with the kind of specificity that does not need to be shouted. Isabella did not stop at recognition. She extended something practical, a chance to be part of a small, protective detail she was assembling for a family trust. Not glamorous, not a return to the old life, but a role that would use what Michael knew in a way that respected his priority. Flexible hours, a steady wage, benefits that made health care for Ethan less of a monthly acrobat. She framed it as an invitation rather than a rescue. She made no promises to change Ethan's condition. She simply offered resources, a steadier hand of community that would allow Michael to breathe. Michael hesitated. The new job would bring new visibility. It would put him inside a world he had left behind. But the offer was different this time. It did not ask him to leave his son. It asked him to be who he already was, a protector, only in a shape that would fit around Ethan, not trample him. "I don't want to be famous," he said in the meeting, his voice plain. "I want my boy to be okay." Isabella nodded. "I know," she replied. "That's why I ask for someone who values what matters at home." In the middle of this, the men from the alley tried to stage a return. Rumors of them showing up near Michael's job made him sleep with the apartment light on for 3 nights. The internet, which had been a chorus of changing opinions, had no more power in those moments than the nervousness in his gut. He called a friend from the old life, not to rekindle a career, not to seek thrills, but to ask for watchfulness. He kept his hand around the broken pen like a habit. When the encounter with the men finally came, it did so on a rain-slicked block with one lamppost buzzing like an old neon sign. They approached him the way people do when they want to prove something to themselves. Michael did not step into a violent posture as if to confuse the world. He moved with the restraint of a man who learned to calibrate force to threat. One of them shoved, another swung. Michael's defense was straightforward and immediate. Break contact, control the opponent, end the threat. He did not seek injury. He enrolled in the smallest set of motions necessary to protect himself. The city swallowed the scuffle into its usual noise. A neighbor called the police. The attackers limped away louder for the rumor of a blow. No one needed to make a spectacle. The video of the second scuffle did not spread as wildly. People were tired of repeating themselves on social feeds. What mattered happened away from cameras. The men left. The neighborhood felt safer. Michael's hands, when he washed them afterward, trembled not from adrenaline, but from the knowledge of how close they had come to a place he refused to return to. When Isabella's public acknowledgement arrived, it did so with an eloquence that kept Michael's dignity intact. She wrote an op-ed that spoke of choosing. She spoke of the quiet ways people protect one another and of the invisible costs of making such choices. She did not sear his story into a single glittering moment. She let it breathe. The city's conversation shifted again, this time toward a slower recognition that did not require applause. Mia continued to come by twice a week. She brought small details that mattered only in the space of the apartment. A new toothbrush for Ethan because the bristles fit his little mouth better. A yogurt he tolerated. A song that made him smile so hard the edges of his mouth twitched. She did not want attention for what she did. When people showed interest in the babysitter with the steady hands, she would say, "He's a fine boy," and that was the end of her part in public discourse. In private, she kept the pen safe in her tote when it had to leave the apartment, a way of acknowledging that things of the past might eventually make way for help. The help Isabella offered wasn't a cure. It was a network. It was a referral to specialists who were willing to choose patience over spectacle and to listen. It was a stable income that meant Michael did not have to decide between a shift or an appointment. It was a man in an office who knew paperwork and had a will to stand up to red tape. It was not magic. It was a small ladder placed against a high wall. There were nights when Michael sat on the stoop, the broken pen in his palm, and watched Ethan asleep through the living room curtain. He thought about the life he had left and the life he had chosen. The pen was not a relic of regret, it was a tool of memory. It kept the knowledge that there were parts of him that were still useful, and, more importantly, parts of him that were entrusted to help. He thought of Sarah, and how she would have laughed at the strange arc of it all, a viral mockery turning into a lifeline that did not require a price. The city has a way of making you large and then very quiet. The clip that had begun as a punchline became, in the end, a story about choices. People brought pies and casseroles for a week, the kind of good neighbors he'd not known he had. A pastor from down the street sent a note about a support group. Michael declined most interviews. He answered emails and wrote polite, short messages. He wanted to live the life he'd promised Ethan, not narrate it for strangers. There was a day when Ethan put his small palm on the pen as if to accept an inheritance that was not about glory. He was 2.5. He tried to make a sound, and his mouth moved in a shape of a vowel that the world could not translate into a word yet. Michael felt a swell of grief, and also a stubborn love that took up space in his ribs like oxygen. He placed the pen in Ethan's small fist for a heartbeat, and then removed it because he did not want to hand him more weight than a child could carry. He smiled with the maladroit, private smile of a father who knew the limits of his good intentions. In private moments, Michael thought about the life he could give Ethan now that the network had softened the sharp edges. He accepted Isabella's offer to consult on a roster that would let him work until he felt steady and then taper. He took appointments for Ethan with specialists who talked about routines and therapy and the patient accumulation of small sounds and signals that sometimes turn into speech over time. The doctors were careful, always using words like possibility and process. They did not make promises. Michael learned to carry their vagueness as a lesson in patience. Mia's hand in all of it was not the force that rewired fate. She was the small instrument that made contact between a man trying to keep his head down and the people who could help. She had found the pen, and in doing so, she did what good neighbors do. She made sure the right person had a witness to a life rather than a rumor. Later, at the cafe where she once told him she had a childless cat that liked to sit on her keyboard, Michael thanked her. He thanked her without ceremony, because his gratitude needed no banner. "You didn't owe me anything," she said, stirring her tea. "You did the right thing. That's worth knowing." He thought of the pen as it sat now, cleaned, its engraving rubbed but legible. He placed it in a small box he kept in a drawer labeled, in his mind, "Things that got me here." The box was not for show. It was a quiet archive of decisions. He lined up Ethan's cars in the drawer next to it, like a small, private shrine. Months passed. There were no fireworks in the public narrative, no parade announcing the redemption arc. There were instead incremental things that looked like dignity regrown. A steady paycheck that allowed Michael to add a little savings account titled Ethan, a referral to a speech therapist who specialized in approaches that started with play and not pressure, a volunteer position Isabella asked him to consider helping with, designing safe passages in community centers for families who needed an extra hand. One evening, as winter's edge began to dull the sky, Michael sat at the kitchen table and watched Ethan stack 2 blocks instead of 1. The boy's fingers were deliberate. He was proud of the small structure he had made, and he turned it to his father with a triumphant face that was all the language either of them needed. Michael picked up the pen and slid it into his breast pocket, like a pulse. The engraving brushed against his hand. It no longer felt like a signpost of a life abandoned or a ticket back. It felt like a compass, a reminder of where he had been and a quiet marker of who he had chosen to be now. Isabella's name faded from headlines and became an occasional email. Mia moved on after a year, the kind of person neighborhoods lose and miss in equal measure. She left a note with Ethan's favorite stickers and a photograph of the 2 of them at the park, both smiling like a photograph could teach the future how to behave. Michael folded that note and placed it in the box with the pen. Once, in the hush of a late Sunday afternoon, a neighbor knocked and handed him a plate. "For Ethan," she said. "For you." She hesitated. "For the man who was there." Michael accepted without fuss and felt the warmth of the gesture like something poured into a cup. He did not seek recognition. The pen had not become a symbol he paraded. But sometimes, in new conversations with parents in the therapy waiting room, or with an old friend who asked how he felt, he would show the pen like you show a mended seam on a child's coat, not for praise, but as evidence of care. When he did, people listened in that particular way that people listen when dignity is intact. One night, as he tucked Ethan into bed, he leaned down and whispered, mostly to himself, "I'll keep protecting you." Ethan blinked slowly, and his small fingers, calloused in ways only childhood invents, found the hem of his father's shirt. There was no fanfare, there was no crowd. There was a man and a child, and the steady rhythm of a house that held them. The public finally settled on a more generous story, a man who had won and then chosen differently, who had small, ordinary days and an extraordinary capacity to show up. People wrote about the viral clip less and wrote more about what choice meant when the price was a life with a small child. Comments still came, some sharp and some kind, but Michael let most of them be rain on a roof. He had a son who liked to stack blocks, a pen in an inner pocket, and a babysitter who once noticed the details others missed. On the anniversary of the clip, Isabella sent a message wishing them well and offering a small grant for Ethan's care. Michael answered with a thank you that was short and true. He did not allow himself to be swept into gratitude as spectacle. He accepted resources that let him breathe out a little. The last scene of the long arc wasn't a ceremony or a viral moment. It was a morning when Michael and Ethan crossed the street together, hand in hand, Ethan's chubby fingers clasping his father's. The sun found the edges of their jackets. A woman on the corner smiled at the pair in a way strangers do when the daily image of a parent's care makes the world feel steadier by just existing. Michael felt no need to explain anything to her. The pen was in his pocket, its engraving a private thing. He had not returned to a life of uniforms, but he had not abandoned the part of himself that protected. He had, instead, learned to move that part into a quieter life where protection meant being present, whether that was holding a crying boy at 2 in the morning or making sure paperwork got filed for insurance. At dinner, Ethan knocked his cup and giggled, a noise that sounded like progress. Mia came by occasionally to bring a meal and to swap stories. Isabella dropped in once to leave a book on a shelf. The community that had once mocked had become a neighborhood that understood, in small gestures, what it meant to hold someone up. The broken pen rested on the kitchen counter now and again, not for show, but as a reminder. If you believe quiet courage matters, stay with stories like this and the people who live in them. They do not always get headlines, and they do not always get medals. They get mornings where someone shows up to teach a child how to stack blocks, afternoons where a babysitter notices the things that matter, and nights where a father chooses to keep his child first. The camera that captured the alley was still somewhere in the cloud of the internet, but it could not capture everything. It could not catch the way Michael warmed his voice for Ethan's bedtime, or how he learned the exact angle his son liked his toast, or the way he smiled when his boy stacked 2 blocks and deemed them a fortress. It could not see the nights he sat on the stoop and considered choices. It could not hold the small, steady kindness of Mia, or the careful outreach from Isabella. Those things lived in the quiet space between the clips. If this story stayed with you, if the kind of unnoticed guardianship it describes matters, share it with someone who might need to hear that dignity can be restored with patience and help. Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people doing the hard, unglamorous work of love.